Alright, this next video is about using this technique called completing the squares to now solve quadratics by completing the square. Alright, in order to do that, we need to understand how to use square roots, how to complete the square, and then we're going to talk about what's the difference between exact and approximated zeros or solutions. Alright, so here are the steps. The first thing that I'm going to do when I want to solve a quadratic by completing the square is I need to make sure that it is set up. So I call this the setup. The first thing with the setup is I want to make sure that A is 1. The second thing, I want to make sure that I have the quadratic piece, the squared piece, the linear piece, the BX piece on the left, and the constant on the right side. All right. Then we're going to complete the square on the left side. And remember, whatever we do to one side, we're going to do to the other. So you'll see as I set this up what I'm talking about. All right. And then we're going to complete the square and solve using square roots. So let's take a look at an example here. So I've got x squared plus 4x minus 6 equals 0. This is a quadratic that cannot be factored to solve. So therefore, I'm going to do this process called completing the square. All right, the first step in completing the square is I'm going to rewrite it as x squared plus 4x plus blank equals 6 plus blank. This is a very important step. If you notice, what I did was I added the 6 to the other side, and then I'm setting up the completing the square by writing the blank spot on the left. But what I did on the left, I also did on the right. So my next step is to complete the square. All right, if I complete the square here, I know to complete it, I take b, which is 4, divided by 2, and that gives me 2 squared. Now instead of writing 2 squared on the left, I write 4 on the right, because 2 squared is 4. All right, that creates for me this new expression, x plus 2 quantity squared is equal to 10. Now, I have it set up in a position where I can now solve it by using square roots. I'm going to take the square root of each side of the equation. And remember, when you take square roots in solving a quadratic, you're going to have plus or minus or positive and negative representation. So x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 10. Okay, so now what I need to do is get x by itself. I'm going to subtract the 2, which leaves me with x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 10. This is an answer. This is an exact solution. In other words, negative 2 plus the square root of 10 and negative 2 minus the square root of 10 are the exact two locations that the quadratic goes through the x-axis. But if you look at it, a lot of us can't figure out exactly where that number is. All right? Or even as an approximated decimal. So this is where the calculator now comes into play to help us. I'm going to take x equals negative 2 plus the square root of 10 and negative 2 minus the square root of 10. And I'm going to type each one of those separately into my calculator. So I just grabbed this calculator. I have negative 2 plus the square root of 10, which in this calculator I have to type in the 10 first. If you notice up on the top there, it says negative 2 plus the square root of 10. Now I have to hit equals to execute that operation. And I get that it's about 1.2, round to the nearest tenth. So x is approximately 1.2. But now I need to do the same thing on the other one. I have negative 2 minus the square root of 10. Execute the operation, I get negative 5.2. Now 1.2 and negative 5.2 make a little bit more sense. In other words, we know where those are. But notice that these are approximated answers. These are not exact. Okay, we rounded to get them. Okay, so let's take a look at another one. Let's say for this one we have x squared minus 8x plus 9 equals 0. Okay, the first thing I want to do is set it up. So I've got x squared minus 8x plus blank equals negative 9 plus blank. All right, I'm going to complete the square. So I take negative 8 divided by 2. That's negative 4 squared. And then negative 4 squared would be 16, which creates this perfect square of x minus 4 quantity squared is equal to negative 9 plus 16, which would be 7. Whoop. Use square roots to solve. And I have x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. Get x by itself. X is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 7. And now I'm ready to approximate. So I've got x is equal to, let's see, I'm going to use the calculator here. 4 plus square root 7 equals. Now I'd round to 6.6. Should have used wavy equal sign there. All right, and then I have to do the second part, 4 minus the square root of 7, which tells me it'd be approximately 1.4. Okay? All right, so what happens now if they give me a problem, a quadratic to solve, but now I have an a value? So I've got 4x squared plus 9x minus 1 equals 0. Okay? It's in quadratic form, but the problem is I now have an a value that's different than 1. All right. In order to do this, the first thing you need to do is ensure that a is equal to 1. So I have to divide each and every piece of the entire quadratic equation by 4. Okay, so let's see here. This leaves me with 1x squared, which is what we want, plus 9/4 x minus 1/4 equals 0 divided by anything is 0. All right. This gets just a little bit more challenging, but the process stays the same. So I'm going to rewrite this in my setup, x squared plus 9/4 x plus blank equals, move that negative 1/4 over, 1/4 plus blank. Now, let's write down how we do this 9/4. I know that to complete the square, you take 9/4 divided by 2. 9/4 divided by 2 would be 9/8. And here's why. If I have 9/4 divided by 2, dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2. All right? So that gave me 9/8 squared. All right? So now I'm going to come over here and I have to square this, so it's going to be 81/64. 9 squared is 81, 8 squared is 64. This completes the square to x plus 9/8 quantity squared. But now I have to add this 1/4 to 81/64. Well, I know that to add fractions, I have to have a common denominator. So I'm going to rewrite this as this 1/4. I'm going to rewrite it as 16/64 plus 81/64, which would leave me with, what is that, 97/64. All right, now to solve, I'm going to use square roots. I get x plus 9/8 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 97/64. All right, I'm going to get x by itself, so x is equal to negative 9/8 plus or minus the square root of 97/64. Now, I could simplify that. I'm not worried about it because they wanted me to approximate my answers. But now comes the tricky part. How do I type this into the calculator? All right. So the first thing that I'm going to do is anytime that I put a fraction into the calculator, I always like to put it in parentheses. So I'm going to do that. Left parenthesis, -9 divided by 8, and I'm going to close that parenthesis, plus parenthesis, left parenthesis, 97 divided by 64, close the parenthesis, take the square root of that, and then execute the addition. That gives me 0.1 rounded to the nearest tenth. Now I need to do the same thing with the subtraction. So I'm going to start again. I have -9/8. Whoop. Let me start that over. I have -9 divided by 8, close parenthesis, that's the first fraction, minus fraction 97 divided by 64, close that fraction, take the square root, execute the subtraction, and that gives me -2.4. All right. Hope these help. Good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.